For more than 70 years, the Chevrolet Corvette has been America's sports car. Blistering speed, a thundering V8, and a price that embarrassed machinery costing 2 and 3 times as much. On paper, it had everything. And yet, for most of those 70 years, the rest of the world refused to take it seriously. So, here's a question worth asking. What if America had handed the Corvette to Japan, a country so obsessed, above all else, with building things properly? To answer that, you have to start with what the Corvette always got right, and the one thing it never could. The Corvette, from the moment it found its feet, was one of the great performance bargains in the history of the automobile. Since 1953, it has been America's definitive homegrown sports car, and for most of its life, it has done something the Europeans found genuinely infuriating. It delivered the speed of cars costing 2, 3, sometimes 4 times as much, and it did it with a big, simple, durable V8 that any decent mechanic could understand. While Ferrari buried exotic engineering under the rear deck and charged a fortune for it, Chevrolet bolted in a thumping small block, kept the price within reach of a working professional, and went toe-to-toe on the only number that wins arguments at a stoplight: how fast it got down the road. That formula made the Corvette an icon. It was the car the dentist bought, the car the returning veteran dreamed about, the car a man rewarded himself with after 30 years on the job. It had presence, it had a soundtrack, and it had a value proposition so strong that the modern car has been called, flatly, the hardest-hitting performance bargain ever built. On raw capability for the money, almost nothing has ever touched it. There was real engineering pride buried in it too. The very first car, back in 1953, arrived with a body made entirely of fiberglass, a genuine novelty in an industry built on stamped steel, and a lightweight idea that would define the car for the next 7 decades. And by the time the 5th-generation Corvette arrived in the late 1990s, Chevrolet had handed it the LS small block, an engine that earned a reputation for being very nearly indestructible, the kind of motor that would shrug off abuse, swallow enormous power upgrades, and keep running long after far more exotic machinery had cried for mercy. When the Corvette was good, it was very, very good. But raw capability for the money was never the whole story of a sports car. And that is where the trouble always lived. For all its speed, the Corvette spent decades fighting a reputation it could never quite shake. The rest of the world looked at America's sports car, admired the engine, and then opened the door. Inside is where the dream tended to fall apart. For generation after generation, reviewers praised the Corvette's performance in one breath and savaged its cabin in the next. The plastics felt cheap. The switches felt borrowed from an economy sedan. There were rattles, squeaks, electronic gremlins, and interior materials that never came close to matching the badge on the hood or the number on the window sticker. The 4th-generation cars of the 1980s brought flashy digital dashboards that didn't always survive the decade, along with buzzing trim and the kind of electrical faults that could turn a Saturday into a diagnostic session. The 5th-generation cars introduced that legendary, near-bulletproof engine, and then wrapped it in a cabin owners still complained about, while some early examples developed a habit of piston slap and an appetite for oil that no sports car buyer wants to discover. There was a steering column lock that became notorious for leaving cars stranded, and even the modern, vastly improved machine drew reviews pointing at hard, cheap plastic and panel gaps, so generous that one road tester managed to slip an entire phone into the seam of the convertible mechanism. The performance kept climbing. The nagging sense that the rest of the car hadn't quite caught up refused to die, and the criticism went deeper than materials. There was a persistent, almost reflexive sense, especially overseas, that the Corvette simply wasn't a serious car, that it was fast in a straight line and clumsy everywhere else, that it was, in the eyes of the European motoring press, brilliantly powerful and cheaply made, a great engine in a car unworthy of it. And there was the nickname that trailed it for decades, the Plastic Fantastic, a nod to the fiberglass body it had worn since 1953. Said with a smile mostly. But the word plastic had a way of sticking, and it captured the quiet suspicion the car could never quite shake: spectacular, and somehow still not entirely serious. This is the heart of the question. The Corvette never lost on speed, and it never lost on price. What it lost, over and over, was respect, the one thing horsepower cannot buy. And respect, as it happens, is exactly what one country had spent decades learning how to engineer. While Detroit chased horsepower and held the line on price, Japan was quietly perfecting something else entirely. Not speed, not flash, build quality, reliability. The obsessive, almost fanatical pursuit of getting every small thing right and then making it last. This was the philosophy that had already humbled Detroit once. Japanese makers had built their entire reputation in America on the simple, devastating promise that their cars would not rattle, would not break, and would not let you down. That the switch would feel solid on the 10,000th press, that the panel gaps would be even, that the thing would still be running long after its rivals had been towed away. Where Detroit treated the interior as an afterthought, the Japanese treated it as the whole point of contact between the car and the human being inside it. So imagine that philosophy turned loose on the Corvette. Imagine the thundering V8 and the knockout price left exactly as they were, but everything the critics hated handed to engineers who consider a rattle a personal failure. The cheap switchgear, gone. The hard plastics, replaced with materials that matched the price. The electronic gremlins, engineered out before the car ever reached a showroom. The build quality finally rising to meet the performance. It sounds like a fantasy, except it isn't, because Japan already built that exact car. Not a Corvette, but the precise experiment of taking the establishment's formula and rebuilding it the Japanese way. And the results rewrote the rules of the entire industry. In 1989, at the very same Chicago Auto Show, where the rest of the world was meeting new family cars, Honda revealed something nobody expected from the company that built the Civic. It was called the NSX, and it was Honda's answer to a question much like this one. What happens when the most disciplined engineers on Earth decide to build a supercar? The target was Ferrari. In that era, a Ferrari was a magnificent, temperamental thing. Gorgeous, thrilling, and notoriously fragile, prone to overheating, awkward to live with, and demanding service bills that could rival the price of an ordinary car. Honda set out to build something that could match a Ferrari on a track and then start every single morning, idle in traffic without boiling over, and be driven to work like a Civic, a supercar with no excuses. To get it right, Honda brought in the one man whose judgment could not be argued with, Ayrton Senna, the McLaren Honda Formula One champion and the most revered driver of his generation, tested the prototype at Suzuka and at the Nürburgring, famously hustling it around the track in a pair of loafers and white socks before telling the engineers, bluntly, that the car felt too flexible. They went back and stiffened the chassis by roughly half again. The result was a mid-engine machine with a high-revving V6, a featherweight aluminum body, and handling honed by the greatest driver of his generation. And it was, famously, a Ferrari without the flaws. And the engineering behind it backed up the theater. This was a company at the absolute peak of its powers. Honda's engines were winning Formula One championships year after year, 6 seasons in a row, beginning in 1986. And that same fanaticism went into the road car. The NSX was the first mass-production car ever built around an all-aluminum body, a choice that cut nearly 200 kilograms against a comparable steel structure and forced Honda to invent entirely new manufacturing methods to pull off. Its 3-liter V6 borrowed titanium connecting rods and forged pistons straight from the racing program, components that let it scream to an 8,000 RPM redline, a figure almost unheard of for a road-going V6. Honda even leaned on a Cray supercomputer, among the most powerful machines on Earth in its day, to analyze and refine the car during its development. This was not a styling exercise with an exotic badge bolted on. It was a clean sheet assault on the supercar, carried out by people who genuinely did not know how to cut a corner. The effect on the establishment was seismic. The NSX proved that balance and precision could beat brute displacement, and it forced Ferrari and Porsche to raise their game across the board. The legendary designer Gordon Murray drove one and said that the moment he did, every benchmark car he had been using, the Ferraris, the Porsches, the Lamborghinis, simply evaporated from his mind. He made the NSX the template for the McLaren F1, and rated Honda's engineering so highly that he twice asked the company to build a bespoke racing engine for the project, and was twice politely turned down. The McLaren F1 would go on to become the greatest supercar of its age, with a humble Honda from Japan woven into its very DNA. Japan had walked into the most exclusive room in the car world and quietly rearranged the furniture. So, the question is not whether Japan could have built a better-made Corvette. The NSX is the proof that they could. The real question is, what would have been gained and what would have been lost? Picture it then. A Corvette engineered with Japanese discipline. The bones stay American. You keep the big charismatic V8 up front because that thunder is half the car's soul, and you keep the price honest because affordability was always the Corvette's secret weapon. But everything the world sneered at gets rebuilt by people who refuse to ship a rattle. The interior is suddenly made of materials that justify the badge. The switches feel machined. The panel gaps disappear. The electronics work on the 10,000th day exactly as they did on the first. And the reliability changes everything about living with the car. The Japanese Corvette doesn't just go fast. It goes fast for 300,000 miles without drama, the way a Toyota does. The owner stops budgeting for the things that might break and simply drives it. The car that was always a thrilling gamble becomes a thrilling certainty. On paper, it is the best of both worlds. American muscle and price, Japanese precision and durability. The kind of car that finally silences the critics who spent 70 years opening the door and frowning. We even know what that obsession looks like in the metal because Lexus had already shown the world. When Toyota launched its first luxury car, the engineers chased perfection to the edge of madness, balancing the engine until the faintest tremor disappeared, agonizing over the weight of a single switch under a fingertip, the sound a door made as it closed, the gap between two panels measured in fractions of a millimeter. Turn that same army loose on the Corvette, and the cheap-feeling cabin doesn't merely improve. It vanishes as a criticism altogether. The one genuinely hard question is the engine. A Japanese Corvette might keep the big, lazy pushrod V8 and simply build it to a higher standard. Or it might do something stranger. The company that gave the NSX its 8000 RPM howl could well be tempted to swap the rumbling small block for a high-strung motor that sings rather than thunders. And right there, before the car has even turned a wheel, you begin to feel what might quietly slip away. This is the version that earns the respect. The motoring press of the world would have nothing left to sneer at. The Corvette would stop being the fast but flawed underdog and start being, simply, one of the great sports cars of the world, admired everywhere, with no asterisk and no apology. It would win the one battle it had always lost. And that is exactly where the story turns, because there is a catch. And once again, the NSX is the one that reveals it. For all that Honda's supercar achieved, for all the respect it earned and the industry it reshaped, a strange complaint followed it from the very beginning. The critics who tested it admitted it was brilliant, flawless, beautifully made, and then said, almost in the same breath, that it felt too perfect, too clinical, too sanitized. That in engineering out every flaw, Honda had also engineered out some of the wildness, the drama, the unfiltered character that made a Ferrari feel alive, even as it overheated on the shoulder of the road. The reviews of the day were openly split. Nobody disputed that the NSX had killed the old myth that a supercar must be hard work, yet a steady chorus of testers still grumbled that it felt more like a brilliant appliance than a wild animal, a precision instrument where its rivals were objects of lust. The NSX was a better-built car than a Ferrari. Some people just didn't love it the same way. Now, apply that to the Corvette, because the Corvette's character is even rawer, even less polished, even more bound up in its imperfections. The slightly cheap, slightly rowdy, slightly unhinged nature of the thing is not entirely a defect. It is part of why people love it. The Corvette is the loud guy at the party, the car that doesn't care what the Europeans think, the working man's middle finger to a price list. Sand off every rough edge, refine every surface, engineer out every flaw, and you might end up with a car the whole world respects, and that the people who actually loved the Corvette no longer recognize. That is the real trade. A Japanese Corvette would almost certainly be a better built car. It might not be a better Corvette, because some of what the critics called cheapness the faithful called soul. So, what if Japan had built the Corvette? The honest answer is that it would have won the argument the Corvette spent its whole life losing. It would have been bulletproof, beautifully finished, and respected from Stuttgart to Maranello. The interior jokes would have stopped. The suspicion that it was spectacular but not serious would have died. On every measure the critics ever used, it would have been the better machine, and it might have lost the very thing that made anyone fall in love with it in the first place. The Corvette was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be more than it had any right to be. Too fast for the money, too loud for the neighbors, a little rough around the edges and proud of it. That contradiction is the car. Fix it, and you may not be improving the Corvette. You may just be turning it into something else. Maybe that is the quiet lesson buried in all of this. Japan already answered the question with the NSX, and even that masterpiece got called soulless by the people who missed the flaws. Perhaps the Corvette was always better off being exactly what it was, the fast, flawed, gloriously imperfect American that the rest of the world never quite understood and never quite stopped watching. The Corvette's flaws and the Corvette's greatness were never two separate things. They were the same thing, seen from two directions. The cheapness that critics mocked was the affordability that made it a hero. The rawness they called crude was the character that made it loved. Hand it to Japan, and the discipline that would have fixed the one would almost certainly have dulled the other. It is a strange kind of compliment in the end. The Corvette is one of the few cars on Earth that might actually be worse if it were built better. It didn't need to be perfect to be a legend. It only needed to be exactly, stubbornly, unmistakably itself. Now, click on this next video to see the real car Honda built to humble the establishment. The everyday supercar that terrified Ferrari and rewrote the rules for everyone. The Honda NSX.